On November 25, 2025, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported some quite intriguing details of a strike against Russian forces in the vicinity of the city of Taganrog, during which a very unusual aircraft was destroyed, the Beriev A-60. Now, if you are not deeply familiar with rare Russian aircraft models, you might think that you've already heard of this one before. However, you are most likely confusing it with another notable Beriev aircraft, the A-50, which made headlines when two of them were shot down by Ukrainian forces in 2024. These two Beriev aircraft, the A-50 and the A-60, are however fundamentally different. While the A-50 is an AWACS aircraft, the so-called eyes in the sky used to detect enemy aircraft, ships and missiles from afar, like for example the Ukrainian missiles that shot down those two A-50s, the Beriev A-60 is, or now was, a unique airborne laser system, what used to be the sole remaining of only two ever built. However, there are also some similarities between the A-50 and A-60. Like its AWACS sibling, the A-60 was also built on the airframe of the Ilyushin Il-76 transport aircraft and retained much of its exterior design, with the exception of a large bulbous nose, which gave it a somewhat clownish appearance. Though, considering the ridiculous circumstances surrounding the loss of the first A-60 model caused by the infamous Russian fondness for alcohol, the clown nose seems to suit the aircraft perfectly well. If this isn't the first video you're watching on my channel, you probably already know that most of my content explores the history of Soviet aviation, the achievements of which, if stripped of cheap propaganda, are most of the time far less remarkable than popularly portrayed. And it is quite often that I get the question, was there ever anything truly good in the USSR? The short answer is yes, of course. Not nearly as much as Russians and their useful friends try to convince you of nowadays, but yes. And one such example, as improbable as it may sound at first glance, lies in one of the most sophisticated scientific fields, laser weapons development. In this domain, the Soviet Union held a considerably competitive position, if not a leading one. And this isn't just my opinion or modern Russian propaganda. American officials were fully aware of this as well, as noted in various government reports, including those from the Secretary of Defense and the CIA, which specifically stated that with regard to laser weapons development programs, the Soviet level of effort is 3 to 5 times greater than that of the United States, and that in some important areas of laser development, the Soviets may actually have the edge over the US. Eventually, however, both the US and the USSR recognized that developing laser weapons powerful enough to shoot down aircraft or ballistic missiles was at the time simply unrealistic, as Nikolai Basov, the Nobel Prize recipient and head of the gigantic Soviet land-based combat laser system Terra-3, once said in an interview in 1994, "We have firmly established that no one can shoot down a ballistic missile warhead with a laser beam, but at least we've managed to significantly advance laser development." But this recognition came only after decades of research and numerous scientific experiments, and back in the 1960s the idea of laser weapons was still considered highly promising and attractive. And thus the Soviets pursued various projects, one of which was the Airborne laser system, codenamed Drift, developed in 1975 to combat high-altitude reconnaissance balloons. At first glance, employing futuristic laser weaponry against something as seemingly archaic as air balloons may sound a bit excessive, if you will. However, that's only if you are not familiar with the magnitude of the difficulties the USSR had been facing while countering US reconnaissance balloons during the Cold War. The thing is, the United States had discovered a simple, effective and relatively cheap method for strategic reconnaissance over Soviet territory: high-altitude surveillance balloons, or automatic drifting balloons as they were called in the Soviet military. These huge balloons, ranging from few thousand to hundreds of thousands of cubic meters in volume and made of ultra-thin polyethylene, carried cameras and other reconnaissance equipment to altitudes from 15 to over 40 kilometers, far above the service ceiling of contemporary Soviet fighter planes. Most often launched from Europe, the balloons would then drift across the entire USSR from west to east using prevailing high-altitude winds. Reconnaissance balloons could stay airborne for up to a month, with cameras capable of photographing strips of terrain up to 65 to 70 kilometers wide. After leaving Soviet airspace, the balloons were typically commanded by radio to descend into the Pacific Ocean, where their equipment was recovered by special teams. Starting from the mid-1950s, when the US began such reconnaissance programs, these balloons were launched either individually or in massive waves, sometimes hundreds at a time, and for Soviet air defense these balloons became a real headache. The thing is, these spy balloons were extremely difficult to detect due to their very low radar signature, and even harder to shoot down. Hitting one from a fighter maneuvering near its operational ceiling was incredibly difficult, and even if a hit occurred, it most often wasn't fatal, leaving only holes in the thin envelope, allowing the balloon to drift down slowly for days or even weeks. To intercept these balloons, sometimes dozens of Soviet fighters were scrambled at the same time, consuming significant resources, particularly jet fuel and munitions. On average, during the 1970s, the amount of ordnance needed to shoot down a single balloon was roughly 1.4 air-to-air missiles, 26 unguided rockets, and 112 cannon shells. While this may not seem critical on a per-balloon basis, multiplied by the thousands of balloons launched, it becomes clear that the balloon war was an extremely challenging and resource-intensive battle for the USSR. Overall, standard fighter aircraft had great difficulty intercepting these high-altitude balloons, and it was clear from the start that the problem required a specialized aircraft. The task of developing proposals for such an aircraft was assigned by the Soviet Council of Ministers to several design bureaus in August 1951. These aircraft did not need to be fast, since the balloons drifted slowly, relying only on wind currents. The critical requirements were the ability to reach extreme altitudes and to maneuver effectively at those heights. Meanwhile, their armament had to include a rapid-fire cannon capable of engaging balloons flying well above the interceptor's service ceiling. One of the first such proposals involved a deep modification of the renowned agricultural Antonov An-2 aircraft. Its deeply upgraded version, designated An-2A, featured a gun turret mounted atop the fuselage, fitted with either a twin 23mm cannon or a heavy machine gun. In 1963, the An-2A successfully completed factory tests, including firing onboard weapons, and was submitted for state trials. Simultaneously, the Antonov Design Bureau was developing the An-25, a similar concept aircraft but equipped with a turbojet engine. However, both projects encountered substantial technical challenges, remaining only on paper. In November 1951, the Yakovlev Design Bureau proposed its own version of a high-altitude balloon interceptor, the Yak-25PA, developed based on their Yak-25RV high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, which could climb to 20 kilometers. However, the project did not gain support from the military and saw no further development, particularly due to the aircraft's engine problems. The idea of combating spy balloons was also considered for the Beriev A-60, the Soviets' 1960 project that essentially attempted to create an exact copy of the American Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. However, the A-60 never even reached flight testing before being cancelled in 1962. Nevertheless, the work carried out during the S-13 program was not in vain and proved useful for the Missishev Design Bureau, which in 1970 was tasked with developing a dedicated balloon interceptor, ultimately resulting in the M-17. The aircraft was equipped with the most powerful Soviet turbojet engine available at the time, an upgraded version of the RD-3651, previously used on the supersonic Tu-144 Konkordsky. Thanks to this engine, the M17 could climb rapidly to extreme altitudes. The Mississippi M17 was equipped with a special optical gun sight capable of detecting a balloon from a distance of 20 kilometers and then automatically tracking it. The aircraft carried on its back a special lightweight gun turret, mounting a twin-barrel 23mm cannon, which allowed the M17 to engage balloons flying 4 to 5 kilometers above the interceptor's own ceiling of 21,500 meters. It could have been an exceptional interceptor for its purpose, if not for one problem: the disappearance of that very purpose. By 1986, when the M17 was in the final stages of testing, it had already been 6 years since the US had cancelled its surveillance balloon program. Soon afterward, an international agreement was signed banning the launch of reconnaissance balloons over foreign territory. As a result, the M17 was no longer needed as an anti-balloon interceptor, and the program was cancelled, with remaining work redirected into the civil sphere. But of course, no one could have predicted that outcome back in the 1970s, when the USSR was actively searching for ways to counter high-altitude balloons. And so, while the first Mississippi M17 was still under construction, the USSR began pursuing another, at the time seemingly more promising idea: an anti-balloon airborne laser system. The development of such an airborne laser to destroy high-altitude drifting balloons began in 1975 and received the code name Drift. The solution seems straightforward: simply mount on an aircraft a specially designed 1 megawatt laser gun. But in reality, that wasn't a simple task whatsoever, considering the size and enormous weight of contemporary laser weapon systems, which had to be mounted either on large ships or designed as gigantic land-based complexes, such as the Terra 3 I mentioned earlier. Yet the renowned Kurchatov Institute managed to build a system small enough to squeeze inside the most up-to-date Soviet transport aircraft of the time, the Ilyushin Il-76. To accommodate this special equipment, several modifications were made to the Il-76, slightly altering the aircraft's exterior. The airborne laser system required a substantial amount of power, so 2 large turbo generators were installed, one on each side of the fuselage under large fairings. The targeting system consisted of a laser rangefinder and a Ladaga airborne radar featuring an upward-facing 1.5-meter Cassegrain antenna housed under a large bulbous nose fairing. The fairing made the aircraft look somewhat clownish, yet it performed its job perfectly, allowing the detection of a balloon at distances of up to 70 kilometers. As for the laser cannon itself, it was housed inside the aircraft's cargo bay. To avoid compromising the aircraft's aerodynamics with yet another bulky fairing, the engineers made the weapon fully retractable. The upper section of the fuselage between the wings and the tail was cut out and replaced with large doors. These doors folded inward, allowing a turret with the laser cannon to rise from within the fuselage to take a shot. The A-60's laser weapon had an effective range of roughly 40 kilometers and, according to its specifications, could fire continuously for 50 seconds, though some sources suggest that in actual tests it only managed about 11 seconds. Regardless, on August 19, 1981, the first experimental A-60 took to the skies. At the time, though, it had not yet received its famous designation and was known simply as 1A, or Il-76 LLBL, which stands for Летающая лаборатория с боевым лазером, Russian for Flying Laboratory with Laser Weapon, or FLAW. By 1983, the full combat laser system had been installed and testing began in earnest. On April 27, 1984, the A-60 conducted a combat trial during which the laser system damaged a target balloon at an altitude of 10,000 meters. Over the course of several dozen flights, the aircraft engaged high-altitude balloons flying at 30 to 40 kilometers, as well as the La-17 target drone. Unfortunately, the exact effectiveness and destructive capability achieved during these tests remain classified. Nevertheless, the A-60 flight test continued and would likely have yielded further results if not for a single catastrophic incident that destroyed the Soviet laser aircraft. The equipment and powerful laser cannon required extensive cooling, and as many of you may already know, the most common coolant in Soviet aviation was none other than alcohol. I've made an entire video on this so-called airbus explaining which aircraft carried it and the most popular cocktails, so to speak, invented and enjoyed by Soviet aviators after working hours. In the case of the A-60, however, the Russians' infamous fondness for alcohol proved to be a literal death sentence for this unique aircraft. It's interesting to see how Wikipedia describes this, so to speak, captivating episode. And no, not the English Wikipedia, which simply notes that 2 Beriev A-60s were built and are now gone, without a word about the disappearance of the first A-60. Let's turn to my favorite, Russian Wikipedia, which states that the first aircraft, 1A, according to some reports, burned down in June 1989 at Chkalovsky airfield during laser testing. Which of course doesn't sound embarrassing or insulting, just an experimental aircraft lost during an experiment. However, the source cited by Wikipedia tells a slightly different story. The Soviet engineer recalls that laser experiments continued right up until the day the aircraft was destroyed by fire. You'll agree that this carries a very different meaning than the aircraft burned down during an experiment. The reason for this semantic gymnastics is simple. Great Russia can't very well admit the true cause of the loss of this unique laser system, as it doesn't align with greatness, though it perfectly illustrates Russia. Here is how Nikolai Yakubovich, author of numerous books on Soviet aviation and formerly an engineer at the Soviet Air Force Research Institute, TSAGI and other institutions, describes the incident of which he personally witnessed the aftermath. One Saturday, the A-60 was parked as usual at Chkalovsky airfield near Moscow. Several aircraft technicians, apparently with big plans for the weekend, snuck inside the plane to drain some alcohol from the cooling system for themselves. But since some of the aircraft systems were still powered, a short circuit occurred during the process and a fire broke out. Frightened by the flames and even more frightened of being caught stealing, the technicians closed and sealed the doors and ran from the aircraft. They called the firefighters and began extinguishing the fire from outside the aircraft, pretending they had nothing to do with it. A fire brigade quickly arrived, but lacking the security clearance to enter a highly classified aircraft without clear justification, and because the technicians, out of fear of being exposed, said nothing about the fire burning inside, the firefighters hesitated to break the seal on the door and immediately entered the aircraft. While the firefighters were getting permissions from their superiors over the radio, flames erupted from the aircraft's doors and windows. Soon a command was issued, get away from the aircraft, and moments later, when fire reached the fuel tanks, a massive explosion erupted, completely destroying the unique laser aircraft. And that was the real laser experiment that ended the first A-60. But to be fair, this incident did not stop the Soviet airborne laser program. Just 2 years later, on August 29, 1991, the second A-60, designated 1A2, took to the skies. It carried a new version of the laser system, upgraded and modified based on tests conducted on the 1A. Its overall mission had also shifted. It was no longer intended to destroy high-altitude balloons, but to blind the optical systems of enemy satellites. Unfortunately, this coincided with the collapse of the USSR, and in 1993 the program was shut down due to lack of funding. It was then restarted in 2002, then closed again, then resumed once more, quietly abandoned and then fully resumed, repeating these cycles for nearly 20 years. It's hard to say what condition the A-60 and its laser system were actually in over the last years of its existence. Likely poor due to the circumstances of the time. But that didn't stop Russian propaganda from regularly touting Putin's laser sword, which constantly frustrated US plans for global domination, and mocking the Pentagon's pathetic attempts to buy time to develop countermeasures against this Russian threat. As it turned out, however, a real countermeasure had long existed, and it's something all Russians understand perfectly well, which is a simple get pissed up, which stands for Precision Impact Zonal Drone Assault. And that's exactly what happened on November 25, 2025, when Ukrainian drones destroyed Putin's so-called laser sword. Given the A-60's condition, it was more of a laser twig than a sword, but it was enough. To be fair, there is still some possibility that Russia's airborne laser program could continue, considering that in March 2020, the Beriev Design Bureau patented the concept of an aircraft carrying laser weapons, further developing the idea behind the A-60 airborne laser aircraft. And indeed, in 2014, a newly upgraded Il-76 was transferred to Taganrog, presumably to install the new airborne laser system, and the aircraft conducted several test flights in 2016. Russia's Deputy Defense Minister Yuri Borisov even stated that flight experiments are ongoing, and the achieved results have confirmed the correctness of the previously made decisions. It's difficult to say what those decisions actually were, given that in 2017 the program was once again declared closed, and for the next 5 years this Il-76 was seen simply serving as a transport aircraft at the Ulyanovsk Air Base. No one really knows, but as always there is a high chance that the whole project was just another scheme to steal money or simply to please the Russian leader, who seems to have a weakness for various Wunderwaffe. Or both. There is a long tradition of such Russian-style military cheating and similar shenanigans. For example, when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was tricked by his own admirals into believing that the USSR possessed an entirely new type of a nuclear submarine that in reality did not yet exist. I made a video about this remarkable episode, which you can watch today on my streaming service Nebula. And there's never been a better time to sign up. You can now get 50% off the annual subscription or just $30 for the entire year. A perfect gift for this holiday season because it includes access to some of the best curated informative documentaries on the internet, such as Mad Kings, which explores the stories of infamous dictators, Vandover's Logistics of Acts, which digs deep into the complex systems we usually take for granted, Logistics of D-Day and the Battle of Britain by Real Engineering, and Bobby Broccoli's 17 pages covering one of the largest scientific controversies of the 20th century. And that's just a small sample, because there are plenty more Nebula originals from other creators already available and with no less ambitious plan for 2026. And all of that is made possible thanks to the support of existing Nebula subscribers. Because Nebula is not like any other platform. It was built by creators and is owned by creators, myself included, which makes it the most sustainable way to support our work. When you sign up using my link in the description, I receive a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed. That support helps us improve our content, and for you, it means no ads, no sponsorship messages, just thoughtful, high-quality content. And if you're still unsure about Nebula, we are also offering a 3-day free trial, and we dare you to try to watch all of that exclusive content in those 3 days. So if you want to support my channel and start enjoying Nebula this holiday season, go to nebula.tv/paperskies or click the link in the description or scan the QR code to sign up and get 50% off an annual subscription. Again, that's just $30 for the whole year. And if you don't want to deal with yet another streaming platform subscription, you can even sign up for a lifetime membership, paying once for unlimited access forever. So click the link and start watching Nebula today.